The air in Fenwick, Virginia, hung heavy with the humidity of late August, a suffocating blanket that mirrored the grief settled over the Miller household. The tragedy of William Miller, their 6-year-old son, had spread through the small town like wildfire, leaving a trail of shock and whispers. He had been found in the quiet, murky waters of Lake Fenwick, a place where generations of children had learned to swim. Now it was a place of sorrow. Sarah Miller, his mother, moved through the house in a daze, her movements slow and deliberate, as if each step was a conscious effort against a crushing weight. Her husband, Thomas, was a pillar of quiet strength, but even his stoicism was fraying at the edges. The funeral was tomorrow, a final, painful goodbye to the boy with the mischievous grin and an imagination that could fill a room. A knock on the front door brought Sarah back to the present. It was Elias Croft, the local photographer, a man known more for his wedding portraits and school pictures than for the somber task he had been hired for. Sarah had hesitated, but the tradition of post-mortem photography, a morbid relic from the 19th century, was a strange comfort in Fenwick. It was a way to have one last, tangible memory, a snapshot of a moment that could never be again. Elias entered, his face a mask of professional solemnity. He carried his old camera, a bulky, archaic piece of equipment with a large flash. The living room had been prepared. William lay on a makeshift bed, dressed in his favorite blue overalls, the ones with a small tear in the knee from his last adventure in the woods. His face was pale, serene, his eyelashes casting a delicate shadow on his cheeks. A perfect, peaceful sleep. Elias set up his camera, adjusting the focus and lighting with practiced hands. Sarah stood at a distance, her hands clasped tightly, a silent prayer forming on her lips. She watched as Elias positioned a small stuffed bear next to William, a final, gentle touch. He then instructed Thomas to stand behind the boy, a hand gently resting on his shoulder. The flash went off, a brilliant white burst that momentarily blinded Sarah. It was over, a memory captured frozen in time. Elias promised to have the print ready by the end of the day. As he packed up his equipment, a strange silence settled in the room, a void where William's laughter used to be. Hours later, the photograph was delivered. Sarah held the 8x10 print in her trembling hands. The image was hauntingly beautiful. William looked so peaceful, so perfect. But as she stared at the photograph, her grief-addled mind began to pick at a thread of doubt, a tiny anomaly that her heart refused to ignore. She brought the photograph closer to her face, her eyes scanning every detail of her son's face. The peaceful expression, the way his hair lay on his forehead, the slight indentation where the pillow met his cheek. It was all perfect, except for one thing: the corner of his mouth. It was slightly, almost imperceptibly turned upwards. A faint, weak smile. "Thomas," she whispered, her voice barely a breath. Thomas looked up from the kitchen table where he was staring into a mug of coffee. "Look at this. Look at his mouth." Thomas took the photograph, his brow furrowed in confusion. "It's just the light, Sarah. He looks like he's sleeping. He looks peaceful." "No," she insisted, her voice rising with a frantic urgency. "It's a smile, Thomas. A faint little smile, just like he would do when he was pretending to be asleep to get out of a chore. And look at this." She pointed to a small, glistening mark just below William's eye. "Everyone said he cried before he drowned. But this is a tear stain, and it's dry." Thomas's expression changed, his eyes widening slightly as he stared at the photograph. He saw it now, too, the faint curve of the lip, the dry tear stain. But the town had mourned a drowned boy. The police had closed the case. The death certificate was signed. "Sarah, it's just your grief," Thomas said, his voice gentle but firm. "You're seeing things. It's a photograph. It's not real." But for Sarah, it was the only real thing in a world that had become a waking nightmare. That faint smile, that dry tear, they were like a whisper from beyond the grave, a message only she could hear. A horrifying, sanity-shredding question began to form in her mind, a question so monstrous she was afraid to even utter it. What if William wasn't dead? What if he was just playing a game of playing dead, a game he had played 1,000 times before? And what if no one, not his father, not the police, not even her, had noticed? The funeral was tomorrow. The small wooden coffin was already waiting at the funeral home. William's grave was dug. He was to be buried alive, in a game that no one else was playing. Sarah's hands trembled, the photograph crinkling slightly in her grasp. The clock on the wall ticked loudly, a cruel reminder of the time she was losing. She had to do something. She had to act. The thought was a searing bolt of lightning, cutting through the fog of her grief. She had to prove that her son was still alive. She had to stop the funeral. She had to exhume the body. She had to do the impossible. But who would believe her? A grieving mother, driven to the brink of madness by a photograph. The town of Fenwick, with its quiet ways and its deep-seated traditions, would turn on her. They would call her crazy. They would say she was disrespecting the dead. But Sarah didn't care. The terrifying thought had taken root, and it was growing, twisting its vines around her heart, squeezing the breath from her lungs. She had to save her son. Even if it meant digging up the past, even if it meant alienating everyone she knew, even if it meant losing her own mind. The mystery of the Fenwick boy was just beginning, and for Sarah, it was a race against the very finality of death. If you're finding this story as captivating as I am, don't miss out on the rest of the journey. Be sure to subscribe to the channel to follow Sarah's terrifying quest for the truth. Sarah's desperate plea was met with a wall of quiet disbelief. Thomas, her husband, tried to reason with her, his voice strained with a grief he could no longer contain. "Sarah, please. You're not thinking straight. He's gone. You need to accept it." His words were a knife twist, but she knew he spoke from a place of love and a need for their shared pain to finally end. The local police chief, a family friend named Officer Reynolds, listened patiently as Sarah, holding the post-mortem photograph, laid out her horrifying theory. He looked at the picture, his gaze lingering on the faint smile. "Mrs. Miller, with all due respect, people can look like they're smiling after death. It's a muscle reaction, the dry tear. It's a photograph. It's not a perfect representation of reality." His words were a professional dismissal, gentle but firm. There was nothing more to investigate. The case was closed. Alone, Sarah felt the full weight of the town's disapproval. Friends and neighbors who had offered condolences and casseroles just a day earlier now looked at her with pity and concern, their whispers following her like a ghost. Poor Sarah. The grief has finally broken her. But she was not broken. She was fighting. She drove to the funeral home, the photograph clutched in her hand. The director, a somber man named Mr. Abernathy, met her at the door. "Mrs. Miller, the arrangements are all in place. Everything is ready." "Mr. Abernathy, I need you to open the casket," Sarah said, her voice shaking but resolute. The man's eyes widened in shock. "Mrs. Miller, I can't do that. It's against protocol. The boy is at peace. You must let him rest." A cold rage, sharp and clean, cut through Sarah's grief. "He is not at rest. He is not dead. And if you don't open that casket, I will." Her voice, once soft and melodious, was now a raw, guttural cry. Mr. Abernathy called Thomas, who arrived minutes later. The scene was one of contained chaos. Thomas, his face pale with shame and exhaustion, tried to lead Sarah away. "You're making a spectacle, Sarah. This is enough." "Is it enough, Thomas?" she screamed, her voice echoing in the silent corridors of the funeral home. "Is it enough for you to bury our son alive?" She was a spectacle, a grieving mother, lost to madness. The town's whispers turned to full-blown rumors. The Fenwick boy, who had drowned, now had a mother who was a source of public shame. They began to avoid her, crossing the street when they saw her, their pity replaced with a palpable sense of unease. But Sarah found an unlikely ally in a retired librarian, an elderly woman named Martha Gable, who had seen and heard everything in her 80 years in Fenwick. Martha had a reputation for being a bit of an eccentric, a keeper of forgotten stories. Sarah found her tending her rose garden, her hands covered in dirt. "Martha, please," Sarah pleaded, holding out the photograph. "You have to believe me. He's not dead. He's just playing a game." Martha took the photograph, her weathered hands surprisingly steady. She looked at it for a long time, a thoughtful expression on her face. "The Miller boy," she said, her voice a low rasp. "Yes, I see the smile, and the dry tear." She looked at Sarah, her eyes piercing and intelligent. "It's not the first time this has happened in Fenwick." Sarah's heart leaped into her throat. "What do you mean?" "The old town records," Martha said, her voice a conspiratorial whisper. "They're not all in the town hall. Some are in my attic. My father was the town clerk for 50 years. He kept copies of everything, the stories they never tell you about in the history books." Martha led Sarah into her small, cluttered house, the air thick with the smell of old paper and dust. In the attic, among boxes of forgotten Christmas decorations and yellowed newspapers, Martha pulled out a leather-bound journal. The pages were brittle. The ink faded. 1932, Martha said, her finger tracing a line on the page. "The Thompson boy, drowned in the same lake. A post-mortem photograph was taken. The mother, Clara, said he was smiling. Everyone said she was crazy. They buried him." Another page. 1958, the Johnson girl, a fall from a tree. The same photograph, the same smile, the same disbelief. She was buried too. A cold dread, deeper than any grief, settled over Sarah. A pattern, a terrifying, silent conspiracy. It wasn't just William. It was a dark history of a town that buried its children alive, a town that chose to ignore the impossible, the town of whispers. "Why?" Sarah asked, her voice a choked sob. "Why would they do this? Why would they bury their own children?" "It's not about malice, dear," Martha said, her voice full of sorrow. "It's about money. The town of Fenwick is a small, quiet place. It's built on a foundation of old secrets and family ties. A death is a tragedy, but a child buried alive, that's a scandal. That's an investigation. That's people from the outside looking in, asking questions no one wants to answer. It's easier to bury a lie than to face the truth." The horrifying realization dawned on Sarah. The local authorities, the funeral home, the townspeople, they were all part of a silent, unspoken pact. A conspiracy of silence to protect their community's reputation, no matter the cost. And the cost was the life of her son. The clock was ticking. The funeral was in a few hours. Sarah felt a new kind of terror, a burning urgency that had nothing to do with grief. This was a battle against an entire town, a fight for the life of her child. She wasn't just a grieving mother anymore. She was a detective, a rebel, a woman on a mission to exhume a lie. She was fighting not just for William, but for the ghosts of all the children buried alive in the forgotten history of Fenwick. The morning of the funeral dawned gray and drizzly, the sky weeping in unison with Sarah's heart. The old journal lay open on the kitchen table, its brittle pages a testament to a horrifying history. She stared at the faded handwriting, a chilling narrative of a town's darkest secret. Her son's fate was intertwined with a legacy of lies and silent complicity. Thomas found her there, a cup of untouched coffee gone cold in her hands. His face was a mask of exhaustion and despair. "Sarah, please, we have to go. They're waiting." "I'm not going," she said, her voice flat. "Not until I get answers." "What are you talking about?" he said, his voice rising in frustration. "Martha's stories? A crazy old woman's ramblings? We have to bury our son, Sarah. You're denying yourself the chance to say goodbye." "He's not dead," she cried, the raw emotion finally breaking through her stoic exterior. She grabbed the journal and thrust it at him. "Read it, Thomas. Read what your town has been doing for decades. This isn't just about William, this is about all of them." Thomas looked at the journal, his expression a mix of anger and disbelief. He snatched it from her, his eyes scanning the pages. His face drained of color as he read the accounts of the Thompson boy and the Johnson girl. The same eerie details, the same dismissals of the mother's pleas. His own town, his own friends, his own family. All of them had been part of this monstrous deception. The phone rang. It was Officer Reynolds. "Mrs. Miller, we're at the church. We're ready for the ceremony to begin. Are you coming?" "No," Sarah said, her voice firm. "I'm not. You're not burying my son today." "You're not burying a boy who might still be alive." There was a long silence on the other end of the line. "Mrs. Miller, I'm going to have to insist you get here. The funeral is scheduled to begin." "You want me to bury my son?" she challenged, a new confidence in her voice. "Then I need to know he's dead. I want you to give me a court order to exhume the body. Now." The line went dead. Reynolds was not a man to be reasoned with. He was a man of procedure, and the procedure said they were to bury the boy today. As the funeral procession began its slow march to the cemetery, a small crowd of people gathered outside the Miller house. They were friends, neighbors, even distant relatives, all with the same look of concern and pity. They had come to support Thomas, to mourn the loss of William, and to coax the mad mother out of her self-imposed isolation. But Sarah had a plan. She had called a friend in a neighboring town, a young, idealistic journalist named Alex Stone, a man who had often tried to get a story out of the sleepy town of Fenwick, but had been met with polite stonewalling. This time, she gave him a story that would rock the entire state of Virginia. She told him about the journal, about the history of buried children, about the chilling photograph of her son. Alex arrived in a beat-up sedan, his eyes wide with a mixture of shock and professional excitement. He was a stranger, an outsider, and that was exactly what Sarah needed. He wasn't tied to the town's secrets, to its old lies. He would see the truth. He listened to Sarah's story, his reporter's notebook filling with notes. He took a photo of the journal, of the faded entries from decades past. He looked at the photograph of William, his eyes lingering on the same details that had haunted Sarah. The faint smile, the dry tear. "This is insane," he said, his voice barely a whisper. "But it's all here. The evidence. We have to get this to the authorities. The state police. The media." "The media is a good start," Sarah said, a glint of steel in her eyes. "But we need more than that. We need a way to prove it, right now, before they put him in the ground." The three of them, Sarah, Thomas, and Alex, drove to the cemetery. The funeral procession was already there. The small white casket was being lowered into the grave. A priest was giving the final rites, his voice a drone in the solemn air. Sarah ran, her heart pounding in her chest. She pushed her way through the crowd, past the somber faces of her neighbors. Thomas followed close behind, his face a grim mask of resolve. "Stop!" Sarah screamed, her voice a raw, desperate plea. "Stop the burial!" The priest stopped, his eyes wide with shock. The townspeople turned to look at her, their faces a mixture of pity and annoyance. Officer Reynolds stepped forward, a hand on his holster. "Mrs. Miller, this is a funeral. You need to stop this." "He's not dead!" she cried, her voice echoing in the quiet cemetery. She held up the photograph. "He's alive! He's still alive!" Alex Stone, standing by his car, had his camera out, his flash going off, capturing the raw, desperate scene. The chaos, the grief, the fear. He was a witness, a force for truth against the town's web of lies. Thomas, his face grim with a newfound resolve, stepped forward, and stood beside Sarah. "She's right," he said, his voice low but firm. "My wife is not crazy. There is a history here, a horrifying history. You've been burying children who were still alive. You've been lying to us all." The crowd erupted in a cacophony of gasps and whispers. Accusations were hurled back and forth. The town's dark secret was out in the open, a festering wound exposed to the light of day. But time was running out. The casket was inches from the bottom of the grave. Sarah ran to the gravesite, her hands a frantic blur as she started to scoop out the dirt. Thomas joined her, his face a grim mask of determination. Alex, his camera still flashing, was capturing every moment of this desperate final act. The townspeople, their faces a mix of horror and disbelief, could only watch. The mystery was no longer a personal one. It was a public scandal, a horrifying revelation. The question remained, what would they find inside the casket? A dead boy, finally at peace, or a child playing a game that had gone horribly wrong? The suspense was unbearable. The answer lay just beneath the surface, waiting to be unearthed. The final act of this nightmare was about to begin. The air in the cemetery was thick with the scent of damp earth and the unspoken horrors that had just been unleashed. Sarah and Thomas, their hands caked with mud, continued to dig with a frantic, desperate energy. The townspeople, who just moments before had been part of a solemn ceremony, were now a mob of onlookers, their faces a mix of shock, fear, and morbid curiosity. The low rumble of whispers had been replaced by the flash of a journalist's camera and the rising panic of a community whose facade of tranquility was crumbling before their very eyes. Officer Reynolds, his face ashen, finally snapped into action. He barked orders into his radio, his gaze fixed on the unfolding spectacle. "This is Reynolds. We have a situation at Fenwick Cemetery. A public disturbance, a potential exhumation. I need a coroner and state police here now, on the double." He approached the grave, his hand hovering over the butt of his weapon. "Thomas, Sarah, you need to stop this. You're desecrating a grave. I can arrest you both right now." But Thomas didn't even look up. "Arrest us then, Roy," he said, his voice strained from the effort. "But we're not stopping until we see our son's face, until we know the truth." The small shovel they had brought was useless against the hard-packed clay. Thomas resorted to his bare hands, clawing at the earth like a wild animal. Sarah, her fingernails broken and bleeding, worked beside him, her focus a singular, terrifying obsession. The priest, his face contorted in a mixture of horror and pity, stepped back, his voice a broken whisper as he watched the sacred ground being violated. As the crowd surged forward, drawn by the raw spectacle, Alex Stone, the journalist, pushed through to the front. He was a beacon of light in the deepening darkness, a witness who would not be silenced. His camera's flash was a relentless strobe, documenting every painful moment of a family's final stand. "What's happening here is more than just a public disturbance, officer," he yelled, his voice carrying over the din. "It's a cover-up. A multi-generational conspiracy." The words hung in the air, cold and damning. The townspeople who had once looked upon Sarah with pity now looked upon each other with suspicion. They were all complicit, tied together by a monstrous secret. They had all been told to look away, to remain silent, to accept the comfortable lie. But now, in the heart of their sacred cemetery, the lie was being dug up for all to see. A small group of men, friends and neighbors of Thomas, stepped forward, their faces grim. "Thomas, stop. You're losing it," one of them said, a man named Mark who had been a pallbearer. "This isn't what William would have wanted." "How the hell do you know what my son wanted?" Thomas roared, a feral glint in his eyes. "You're all part of this, aren't you? All of you. You watched me put my boy in the ground, and you said nothing." The confrontation was diffused by the blare of sirens. A state police car, followed by an ambulance, pulled onto the grassy lawn. Two officers, their faces stern and unyielding, approached the scene. A man in a paramedic's uniform, his medical bag in hand, ran towards the grave, his eyes wide with a mixture of professional curiosity and human compassion. The state police officers, men from outside Fenwick with no ties to its grim history, took control of the situation. "All right, everyone back up. You two, out of the hole. We'll handle it from here." One of them, a tall, no-nonsense officer with a name tag that read Detective Harrison, knelt by the grave. He looked at the frantic couple, then at the half-buried casket. He looked at the crowd of sullen faces, and finally, he looked at the open journal Alex was now holding. His eyes, trained to see patterns, saw a truth in the raw desperation before him that no official report could ever capture. "You're going to have to make a case for a court order," he told Sarah, his voice low and calm. "But given the circumstances, I think we have enough to request a provisional examination." Sarah's heart, which had been a frozen lump of despair, began to thaw. A glimmer of hope, fragile as a spider's silk, began to form. They had a chance. The casket was pulled from the earth, its white surface smeared with mud. It was placed on the ground, a stark, terrifying object of morbid curiosity. The crowd held its breath. Detective Harrison looked at the paramedic. "You're a medical professional. Can you verify anything?" The paramedic knelt, his hands trembling slightly as he opened the box of his tools. I can try, but if he's been in here for, well, it's been over 24 hours. The suspense was unbearable. The crowd was a silent, anxious mass. The only sounds were the shutter of Alex's camera and the frantic, shallow breaths of Sarah and Thomas. With a final, terrible heave, Detective Harrison pried open the lid of the casket. The sound was a loud, chilling pop, a final punctuation mark to a week of hell. Sarah and Thomas knelt by the edge, their faces etched with a profound, soul-shattering terror. Inside, William lay peaceful and still. His skin was pale, his lips slightly blue, the effects of a body left unpreserved. He was in his blue overalls, the small tear on the knee now a poignant testament to a life cut short. He looked exactly as he had in the post-mortem photograph, the faint, almost smile still on his face. The paramedic leaned in, his small flashlight beam illuminating the boy's features. He placed a hand on his forehead, on his neck. Then he put his stethoscope to the boy's chest, pressing down hard, his face a mask of concentration. The silence was absolute. No one dared to breathe. Then, the paramedic's eyes went wide. He pulled off his stethoscope and looked at Detective Harrison, his face a mix of disbelief and horror. He said nothing, but his eyes said it all. The truth was laid bare in that muddy grave, a truth so monstrous it defied all belief. William Miller, the Fenwick boy, had not been drowned. He had been buried alive. The faint smile on his face, the dry tear. They were a last, desperate act of a boy playing a game no one was meant to win. Sarah's world, already shattered, was now a kaleidoscope of terror and relief. She had been right. Her son, her little boy, had been alive. But she was too late. The relief was a cruel, punishing thing. She had solved the mystery. She had fought the town. She had unearthed the truth. But in the end, her victory was as empty as the casket that now held her son's body. The weight of what she had just discovered, the weight of her failure, was too much to bear. She had been so close. The mystery of William Miller's drowning was over. The true nightmare of his burial had just begun. The hunt for the truth was now a hunt for a murderer who lived among them, who had let a little boy die, who had watched his mother bury him alive, and who even now was probably watching from the crowd. The horror had a name, and its name was Fenwick. The aftermath of the exhumation was a whirlwind of chaos and media frenzy. The small, quiet town of Fenwick was thrust into the national spotlight. News vans and reporters from every major network descended upon the town, their cameras and microphones hungry for the macabre details of the Fenwick boy. The peaceful town, a symbol of rural American life, was now a living testament to a horrifying crime. Sarah and Thomas were taken to the local police station, not as suspects, but as witnesses. Detective Harrison, a man of quiet competence, took their statements. He listened to Sarah's story, her voice raw and hoarse, about the photograph, the gut feeling, the visit to Martha Gable. He listened to Thomas's tearful account of his own initial disbelief and the dawning horror of the truth. Martha Gable, the elderly librarian, was also brought in. She handed over the old journals, her hands trembling, her eyes full of a righteous 80-year-old fury. The journals, once dismissed as the ramblings of a crazy old woman, were now evidence. The names of the other children, the Thompson boy, the Johnson girl, were now front-page news. Their tragedies, once buried, were now a national scandal. The town itself was in a state of civil war. Neighbor turned against neighbor. Accusations flew. The once tight-knit community, built on generations of shared history, was now a house of cards, its foundation rotted by a silent, unspoken pact. A group of angry citizens gathered outside the police station, their voices raised in protest, some demanding answers, others defending the town's honor. But the police, under the direction of the state authorities, were focused on a new investigation: murder. The post-mortem examination of William's body, conducted by an independent team of forensics experts, confirmed Sarah's horrifying theory. William had been alive when he was placed in the casket. The cause of death was asphyxiation, a slow, agonizing suffocation. His lungs contained no water. He had not drowned. He had been murdered. The case was no longer an accident. It was a cold-blooded crime. And the killer, the person who had orchestrated this monstrous act, was still at large. The focus of the investigation turned to the day of William's drowning. The police re-interviewed everyone involved, from the first responders who had found the body to the local coroner who had signed the death certificate. The official report stated that William had drowned in Lake Fenwick. But who had found the boy? It was a group of his friends, teenagers who had been swimming at the lake. They were questioned again, their stories now under a microscope. The police also looked at the funeral director, Mr. Abernathy, and the local coroner, a man named Dr. Owens. Both of them had been part of the cover-up for the Thompson and Johnson children as well. Their families had been in Fenwick for generations, and they had a history of covering up things that could hurt the town's reputation. Dr. Owens had signed the death certificates for all 3 children. It was a family business, this conspiracy. But who had been the primary perpetrator? Who had been the person to put William in the water, to hold him down, and then to present him as a drowned boy? The teenage boys who had found the body insisted they saw William floating face down in the water. They didn't touch him. They ran for help. The first person they found was Officer Reynolds, who had arrived on the scene minutes later. Reynolds, a man who had seemed like a decent, by-the-book officer, was now a primary suspect. He had been a pallbearer at the funeral. He had a history of being a close friend of the Miller family. Could he have been involved? Sarah and Thomas, now staying with Martha Gable, found a new purpose in their grief. They were no longer just victims. They were crusaders. They worked with Alex Stone, the journalist, who had become their closest confidant. Alex, a man with a nose for a good story, was now deeply invested, not just for the scoop, but for justice. He used his media contacts to keep the pressure on the local and state authorities, ensuring the case wouldn't be swept under the rug. The town, for its part, was in a state of siege. The residents were scared. They were afraid of the media, afraid of the police, and most of all, afraid of each other. The old trust, the old bonds of community, were gone. The whispers had turned to screams. But the most chilling part of the investigation was a simple, yet terrifying fact. William had not been buried immediately after his death. He had been kept at the funeral home for a full 24 hours. The police now had a timeline, a window of opportunity where the murder could have taken place. The coroner, Dr. Owens, had been the one to sign off on the body being transported to the funeral home even before the death certificate was officially signed. It was a massive breach of protocol, a silent nod to a secret that had been passed down for generations. The conspiracy was much deeper than Sarah had ever imagined. It wasn't just about burying a child alive. It was about protecting a horrifying secret that went to the very core of Fenwick's identity. But what was that secret? What was so terrible that they would sacrifice their own children to protect it? The motive was still missing. They had the means, they had the opportunity, but they didn't have the reason, they didn't have the why. And until they found the why, the true monster of Fenwick would remain in the shadows, watching, waiting, and perhaps preparing to strike again. The horror had just begun. The investigation into the Fenwick boy's death was a slow, agonizing process. The authorities were facing a wall of silence. The townspeople, once willing to gossip about their neighbors, were now tight-lipped, their faces a mix of fear and defiance. The local police, under the scrutiny of the state police, were defensive and uncooperative. The old allegiances ran deep. Sarah, Thomas, and Alex, working with what felt like a ticking clock, took it upon themselves to find the answers the authorities couldn't. They started with the victims, the two other children who had been buried alive. The Thompson boy from 1932 and the Johnson girl from 1958. They began with the Thompson family. The old records indicated that the Thompsons had left Fenwick shortly after their son's funeral. They had been outsiders, a family who had moved to the town just a few years before the tragedy. Sarah found a distant relative of the Thompsons living in a nursing home in a neighboring state, a frail, elderly woman named Eleanor Thompson. Eleanor's mind was sharp, though her memories were clouded with the mists of time. She remembered her great-aunt Clara, the mother of the drowned boy. She remembered the whispers, the talk of madness. Clara said he was smiling, Eleanor said, her voice a reedy whisper. Everyone said she was crazy. My family said we had to move, that Fenwick was a cursed place. They said the town had a secret they would kill to keep. But what was the secret? Eleanor couldn't say. She only remembered her father talking about the pact, a secret handshake, a code of silence passed down from generation to generation. It was a code of honor to protect the town, to protect its reputation no matter the cost. Next, they looked into the Johnson family. The Johnson girl had died in 1958. Her family had not moved. They were a cornerstone of the Fenwick community, a family of quiet wealth and deep-seated roots. Sarah found the daughter of the Johnson girl's parents, a woman named Susan, who still lived in Fenwick. Susan was in her late 50s, a woman of deep sadness and quiet desperation. Susan met Sarah and Thomas in a diner on the outskirts of town, away from the prying eyes of the locals. "My mother never got over it," Susan said, her hands wrapped around a mug of tea. "She would stand by my sister's grave and just cry. She said she felt her calling to her. My father, he just shut down. He didn't talk about it, none of the family did. It was just swept away." Susan revealed a chilling detail. Her father, a prominent businessman, had received a large sum of money from an anonymous source shortly after his daughter's death. He had never spoken about it. He had always been a man of integrity, but this money had changed him. He had built a new factory, expanded his business. It was blood money, Susan now realized. Payment for his silence. The pieces were beginning to fit together. This wasn't just a conspiracy of silence. It was a conspiracy of corruption. The town's leaders, the prominent families, were not just covering up murders, they were profiting from them. The question was, who was orchestrating it all? Who was paying the price of their silence? Alex, using his media contacts, got access to the coroner's old files. Dr. Owens, the man who had signed William's death certificate, had a long history in Fenwick. His father had been the coroner before him. They had a long history of signing off on deaths that were convenient. Accidental drownings, falls, unexplained illnesses, all of them from prominent families in Fenwick. And all of them had one thing in common: a large inheritance, a payment. A horrifying possibility began to form in Sarah's mind. The murder was not just a one-off thing, it was a business. The motive wasn't revenge or hate, it was greed, a monstrous, soul-crushing greed. But who was the mastermind? Who was the person who benefited from all of these tragic deaths? Sarah, Thomas, and Alex focused their investigation on the last case, the most recent one, the Miller family. William had no inheritance. He was just a boy. Why would he have been chosen? There had to be another reason, a reason that was much more personal, much more sinister. They went back to the old journals, reading them with a new, horrifying understanding. The entries weren't just about children being buried alive. They were about the town's founding families. The same names popped up again and again: the Owens, the Croft, the Reynolds, the Fenwick family themselves, the founders of the town. These were the names of power, of influence, of control. And then they found a detail that sent a cold shock through Sarah's system. An old deed, a land document from the 19th century, was tucked into the back of one of the journals. It was a land deal between the Fenwick family and a new family who had moved to the town, the Miller family. The land where their house was built had once been owned by the Fenwicks. A small, seemingly insignificant detail, but a detail that connected them, the Millers, to the town's darkest secret. But the most shocking revelation came from a faded, almost unreadable photograph in the journal. It was a picture of a group of men, all in their late 20s, standing by the lake. The photograph was from the year 1958. Among the faces, Sarah recognized one, a face that was now wrinkled and aged, but still unmistakable. The face of the man who had taken her son's post-mortem photograph, Elias Croft. He was there, at the lake, the day the Johnson girl died. He was the same age as her father. He was a member of the inner circle, the man who had been hired to take the photograph of her son, the man who had, inadvertently, given her the first clue to her son's fate. He wasn't just a photographer. He was a silent partner in the conspiracy. He had been there from the beginning. He was a witness to all the lies, all the buried children, all the money. The horror was no longer an impersonal crime. It was a personal betrayal. A betrayal from the very people who had feigned sympathy and grief. The people who had pretended to mourn with them, all the while knowing the horrifying truth. The conspiracy wasn't about money. It was about something much more sinister. It was about power. And they had just found the first name on the list. The horror had just gotten personal. The next move was theirs, but the town of Fenwick was a snake pit, and they were walking right into it. The climax was coming, and they were finally ready to face the real enemy, the men who had been playing God for decades. The photograph of a young Elias Croft standing by the lake in 1958 was the key that unlocked a new and terrifying reality. He wasn't just a bystander, he was an accomplice. His knowledge of the town's darkest secrets wasn't a coincidence, it was a profession, passed down from his father, the town's original post-mortem photographer. He was a man who had made a living from photographing death, and in doing so, had become an active participant in it. Sarah, Thomas, and Alex knew what they had to do. They had to confront him. They found Elias at his studio, the same studio where he had taken William's last photograph. The place was an anachronism, filled with sepia-toned portraits and the faint smell of chemicals. He was a man in his 60s, his hands shaking slightly as he worked on a picture of a newlywed couple. "Mr. Croft," Sarah said, her voice a tremor of contained rage. "We need to talk to you about what you do, about what you did." Elias looked up, his face a mask of weary defeat. He looked at the photograph of himself from 1958 in Alex's hand, and his shoulders sagged. The jig was up. He gestured for them to sit, his movements slow and tired. He poured himself a glass of water, his hand shaking so violently the liquid sloshed over the rim. "I knew this day would come," he said, his voice a low, raspy whisper. "I've been waiting for it my whole life. I've been waiting for someone to finally see it." The faint smile, the dry tear. He confessed, not with a sense of remorse but with a horrifying detached resignation. He told them about the pact. The Fenwick boy wasn't the first, and he wasn't the last. He was just the most recent in a long line of victims. The pact was a secret society, a group of the town's founding families, a society that controlled everything. The police, the coroner, the funeral director, the banks. They controlled the town, and they would do anything to protect their power. "It started with my great-grandfather," Elias explained, his gaze distant. "He was the town's first photographer. He noticed a trend. The children of the old families were dying, but they weren't sick. They were put to rest. And the families who buried them became richer, more powerful. There was always a transfer of wealth, a new business deal, a new house. My family was given the photography business. It was a way to keep us quiet. We were observers. We were keepers of a dark history." He spoke of the Thompson boy, a child of a family that was threatening to expose a corruption scandal involving the Fenwick family. The boy was drowned, the family was silenced with money, and they left town in shame. The Johnson girl's father had inherited a large piece of land that the society wanted for a new factory. Her death had been a way to acquire the land, to silence the family, to keep the money flowing. But what about William? The Millers were not a threat. They were a quiet, unassuming family. What did they have that the society wanted? Elias's voice dropped to a conspiratorial whisper. "The Miller family is a special case. You're not from a founding family, you're newcomers. Your house, your land. It's built on a cursed place. The old Fenwick family. They never gave up that land. They were told a terrible prophecy." Sarah felt a wave of nausea. A prophecy? Was he just a crazy old man? Was he making things up? "What are you talking about, Elias?" she asked, her voice shaking. No, Elias said, his eyes wild with fear. "It's not a prophecy. It's a curse. The curse of the Fenwicks. They say a Fenwick heir will never inherit the land. That's why they sold it to you, to break the curse. But the curse, it's not a curse. It's a man. A man who has been controlling this town for decades. A man who has been orchestrating these deaths for years." He shuffled through a pile of old photographs on his desk. He pulled out a faded portrait of a young man in his 20s. He was a member of the Fenwick family, a distant cousin of the founders. He looked like an ordinary man, but his eyes held a cold, calculating glint. "This is the man," Elias whispered, his voice trembling. "He's the one who controls the money. He's the one who orchestrated the deaths. He's a ghost. He's never seen, but he's always there. He's the real mastermind. He's the one who wanted your son dead. And he's still here. He's still in this town." Elias had one more piece of evidence, a small black notebook filled with meticulous notes. It was a photographic journal of every death, every lie, every transfer of wealth. It was a ledger of a town's darkest secrets, a ledger of murder. He handed it to Sarah, his hands trembling. "Take it. It's all in here. All the evidence you need." As they were about to leave, they heard a noise, the sound of a door being unlocked. Someone was coming. Elias's eyes went wide with terror. "He's here," he whispered, his voice a panicked sob. "He knows. He's here to stop us." The door swung open, and a man walked in. He was a man in his 70s, with a shock of white hair and a kind face. He was the head of the Fenwick Historical Society, a man they had seen at the funeral. He was a man of quiet authority, a man who had always been a respected member of the community. He was the ghost, the mastermind. The man who had been hiding in plain sight. The man smiled, but there was no warmth in his eyes, only a cold, horrifying calculation. "I'm sorry, Elias," he said, his voice as calm as a summer breeze, "but you've been talking to the wrong people." The chilling reality of the conspiracy was no longer a theory. It was a face. It was a voice. The killer was not just a shadowy figure. He was a man who had been watching them, who had been orchestrating their demise from the shadows. The final act of this horrifying drama was about to begin. The final twist was in place. The horror was now a personal battle. A fight for their lives. You've made it this far, but the journey to the truth is far from over. If you want to see how Sarah and Thomas confront the true evil of Fenwick and uncover the final bone-chilling secrets of the town, don't forget to subscribe. Every like and comment helps us tell this story and ensure that the truth about the Fenwick boy is finally heard. The man standing in the doorway was George Fenwick, a direct descendant of the town's founders. He was a pillar of the community, a man who had been praised for his philanthropic work and his dedication to preserving the town's history. But in his eyes, Sarah saw a cold, calculating void. The kind face was a mask, and behind it was a monster. "George," Elias stammered, his body rigid with fear. I was just showing them some old photos." George ignored him, his gaze fixed on Sarah. "The Miller family," he said, his voice a low, chilling purr. "Such a shame about your boy. A true tragedy. The kind of tragedy that brings a community together." "You did this," Sarah whispered, her hands clutched tightly around the black notebook. "You killed my son." George's smile didn't waver. "I didn't kill him, Mrs. Miller. I just facilitated his passing. He was a beautiful boy, full of life, but he was in the way." The confession, so calm and matter-of-fact, was more terrifying than any scream. Elias, paralyzed by fear, could only watch as his life's work, the notebook filled with a lifetime of secrets, was being used against him. "This notebook," George said, his eyes fixed on Sarah's hands. "It contains a lot of secrets. Secrets about this town. Secrets about my family. Secrets about you." Sarah's heart pounded in her chest. "What do you want?" she asked, her voice trembling. "I want the notebook," George said, his voice calm and reasonable. "And I want you to forget all this. The town's reputation has been tarnished enough. Let's just put it all behind us. I can make all of this go away. The investigation, the media, all of it. We can say it was all a misunderstanding, a mother's grief, a misdiagnosis. No one will ever know the truth." "No," Sarah said, her voice filled with a new, terrifying resolve. "I won't let you get away with this. Not after what you did to my son, not after what you did to all of them." George's face darkened. The mask of civility began to crack. "You don't understand, Mrs. Miller. This is not about murder. This is about power, about control. This town is mine. It has been for generations. We, the Fenwicks, we built it. We run it, and we will do anything to protect it. My family, the Crofts, the Reynolds. We all have a role to play. We have a pact, an ancient bond. We protect our legacy, our land, our power." He stepped forward, his eyes burning with a cold fire. "Your son, Mrs. Miller. He was a complication. He was an innocent child, but his death was necessary. He was the last heir to a prophecy, a curse." Sarah looked at Elias, her heart pounding. What is he talking about? The Fenwick family, they made a pact with a wealthy land speculator in the 19th century. Elias explained, his voice a terrified whisper. They sold him a large piece of land, a very valuable piece of land. But they didn't know he was a man of science, a man who was a believer in human sacrifice. He used the land to conduct experiments. And when the townspeople found out, they took him. They burned his house. But before he died, he put a curse on the land. He said that a child born of the bloodline of the families who had killed him would one day reclaim the land and destroy the town. George laughed, a chilling, humorless sound. A curse is just a word, a rumor. The truth is the land is just a piece of real estate. Very valuable real estate. But the story is a weapon we use to make people believe, to make them believe in magic, in prophecy, in curses, to make them think we were special, chosen. We weren't. We were just men who wanted to control our own destiny. The horrifying truth was laid bare. There was no prophecy, no curse, only a meticulously crafted lie, passed down for generations. The lie was the power. The lie was the currency. The lie was the reason for all the murder. Your house, your land. It was the last piece of the speculator's land, George explained, his voice almost gleeful. And your son, Mrs. Miller, he was born on that land. He was born with a birthmark, a small cross-shaped mark on his ankle. It was the same mark as the speculator. You see, the speculator's family, they were all killed. All of them, except one. And that one, he was a Miller. A cold, sick feeling washed over Sarah. Her family, her husband's family, they had been part of this. They had been the ones who had killed the speculator. They had been the ones who had been cursed. And now, they were paying the price. Your husband, Mrs. Miller, George said, his voice a low, menacing hiss. He's the last descendant of the Miller family. He's the last one. And your son, he was the last one who could reclaim the land, the last one who could expose us. Sarah looked at Thomas, her face a mask of horror. Her husband's family. They had been part of this. They had been part of the original conspiracy, and now their son, their innocent son, had paid the price. George reached for the notebook, a cold glint in his eyes. Now, give me the book, and we can end this. No one else has to get hurt. But Alex, the journalist, was not a man to be trifled with. He had been a silent observer, a witness to a confession that would rock the entire nation. He had been recording the entire conversation on his phone. I think I'll be keeping this, George, Alex said, his voice a mix of fear and triumph. The entire world is going to know what you did. The pleasant mask on George's face dissolved completely. His eyes burned with a murderous rage. He lunged at Alex, his hands outstretched, his face a contorted mass of fury. The game was over. The charade was done. The monster was out of its cage. The chase was on. The truth had finally come out, and it had a name. And its name was George Fenwick. The quiet serenity of Elias Croft's studio shattered into a cacophony of terror. George Fenwick, his face contorted with rage, lunged at Alex. Sarah, acting on pure instinct, screamed and pushed Thomas aside, grabbing a heavy camera from a nearby table and swinging it at George's head. The old man, though frail in appearance, moved with a shocking predatory speed. He dodged the blow and shoved Sarah violently against a wall. The notebook, her last hope for justice, flew from her hands and skidded across the dusty floor. "Get out of here!" Thomas yelled, grabbing a lamp and swinging it like a bat. "Run, Alex, run!" Alex didn't need to be told twice. He sprinted out the door, the precious phone in his hand, a digital record of a generations-old conspiracy and a horrifying confession. George, his eyes burning with a desperate fury, ignored Thomas and Sarah and gave chase. "I'll get him. You two stay put." George snarled, a threat that hung heavy in the air. Thomas, his face a grim mask of resolve, turned to Sarah. "We have to get out of here. He's not going to stop. He's going to kill Alex, and then he's going to come back for us." They scrambled for the door, but the sound of an alarm blared to life. George, a master of control, had activated a silent alarm as he left. He was not just a murderer. He was a man who planned. A man who thought 5 steps ahead. Sirens wailed in the distance, growing closer. But they weren't the police, they were private security, a company owned by one of the families in the pact. A company that was now a hunting party, its target Alex Stone. Sarah and Thomas ran out of the studio, their hearts pounding in their chests. The streets of Fenwick, usually so quiet and safe, were now a terrifying labyrinth. They could hear the wail of sirens, the frantic, desperate sound of a town turning on itself. They knew they couldn't run forever. They had to get to the police station. They had to find Detective Harrison. He was their only hope. As they ran, they passed familiar faces. Neighbors, friends, people they had known for years. Their faces were a mixture of fear and betrayal. They were the people who had kept the secret, the people who had watched them suffer, who had pitied them all the while knowing the truth. The entire town was a living, breathing lie. They made it to a payphone, their hands trembling as they dialed the police station, but the line was dead. George had cut the phone lines. He had planned for every contingency. He was not just a murderer. He was an architect of sorrow. "We have to go back to the cemetery," Thomas said, his voice low and firm. "We have to get to the grave. He's going to try to kill Alex. We have to be there. We have to expose him. For William. For all of them." The cemetery was the one place where they had found the truth. It was the one place where the lie had been exposed. It was the only place where they could find justice. They ran, their lungs burning, their bodies ached with a profound, soul-crushing weariness. They arrived at the cemetery, their eyes scanning the tombstones, their ears listening for the sounds of a struggle. The wail of the sirens was closer now. The private security was closing in. They found him near William's grave. Alex, his face pale with terror, was being held at gunpoint by a man in a black suit. The man was one of George's security guards, a man who had been a friend of the family for years, a man they had trusted. "You're not going anywhere, Mr. Stone," the man said, his voice a low, menacing hiss. "George wants the phone, and he wants you to forget everything you saw." But then, a new voice, a voice they had not expected to hear, broke the silence. "Let him go." It was Officer Reynolds, his face a mask of sorrow and shame. He had been a part of the cover-up. He had been a friend to the family. He had been one of the pallbearers, but now he had a gun in his hand, and it was pointed at the security guard. "Roy," the man said, his voice filled with a mixture of fear and betrayal. "You're not doing this. You're part of the pact. You're one of us." "I was," Reynolds said, his voice filled with a quiet, terrible resolve. "I was. But not anymore. Not after what he did. Not after what he did to that little boy. I can't live with this. I can't live with the guilt. Let him go." The security guard, a man who was trained to follow orders, was caught in a moment of indecision. He looked at Reynolds, then at Alex, then at Sarah and Thomas. He knew the pact. He knew the rules. But he also knew the man in front of him, a man who was a part of the town, a man who had just broken the pact. And in that moment of hesitation, Alex, a journalist, a man of words, acted. He slammed his hand against the security guard's hand. The gun went off with a loud bang, the bullet burying itself in the soft earth. Alex grabbed the phone and ran. The security guard, his face a mask of shock, looked at Reynolds, then at Sarah and Thomas. He looked at the grave, at the freshly dug earth. He saw the truth. He saw the monster he had been protecting. And he saw a choice. A choice between his family's legacy and his own humanity. He chose the latter. He dropped his gun and ran, not to protect George, but to protect his own soul. He was a man who had made a terrible mistake, a man who was now a fugitive. Reynolds, his hand shaking, lowered his gun. He looked at Sarah and Thomas, his eyes filled with a lifetime of shame and regret. "I'm so sorry," he said, his voice a choked sob. "I should have listened. I should have done something." But there was no time for apologies. The wail of the sirens was closer now. They were out of time. They had to get to the police station. They had to get the truth out. They ran, their bodies a mix of exhaustion and adrenaline. They ran towards the sound of the sirens, towards the light of the police station. They ran towards a new beginning, a new life, a life where the truth was finally out. The horrifying story of the Fenwick boy was finally a story. And it was a story that would change everything. The final climax was coming, and they were ready to face it. The streets of Fenwick were a battlefield of lights and sirens. State police cars, their red and blue lights flashing, had converged on the small town. The media, their cameras and microphones at the ready, had turned the local police station into a circus. The truth, once a hidden monster, was now out in the open, a raw, festering wound for all to see. Sarah, Thomas, and Alex, with Officer Reynolds in tow, finally made it to the police station. They burst through the doors, their bodies a mix of exhaustion and adrenaline. Detective Harrison, the state police officer, was there, his face a mask of quiet competence. "We have it all," Alex said, his voice hoarse from the running. "We have the confession. We have the proof. We have the notebook. George Fenwick. He's the one." Detective Harrison, a man who had been a witness to a town's long, slow descent into madness, nodded. "We know. We've been listening to you. We've been following you. We had a wiretap on Elias Croft's phone. We knew everything. We just needed to prove it." The state police officers, men from outside of Fenwick, with no ties to its long, dark history, had been working in the shadows, building a case. They had been watching George Fenwick, watching the families of the pact, watching them as they tried to clean up their mess. They had been watching them as they tried to silence the truth. George Fenwick was arrested at his home, a sprawling mansion on the outskirts of town. He was calm, collected, a man who had just lost a game. He was not a monster in a horror movie. He was a man who had been playing God for decades, a man who had thought he was above the law. He was just a man who had killed children to protect his power. The aftermath was a long, painful process. The bodies of the other children, the Thompson boy and the Johnson girl, were exhumed. The medical examiners, using modern technology, were able to confirm what Sarah had always known. They had not been drowned. They had not died from a fall. They had been murdered. The families of the pact, the old families of Fenwick, were all arrested. The coroner, Dr. Owens, the funeral director, Mr. Abernathy, and the mayor, a man who had been in office for decades. They were all complicit. They were all part of the conspiracy. They had all been bought with money, with power, with a promise of a quiet life. The town of Fenwick was a ghost town now. The media was gone, but the stain of the truth remained. The town's name, once a symbol of rural American life, was now synonymous with a horrifying crime. The town's legacy was forever tarnished. Sarah and Thomas, their hearts a mix of relief and profound sorrow, were left to pick up the pieces of their lives. They had a funeral for William, a real funeral this time. A funeral where they knew he was finally at peace. They buried him in a new grave, in a new town, a town where the past was not a buried monster. The horror of The Fenwick Boy of Virginia was not about a ghost in a haunted house. It was about a town's long, dark descent into madness. It was about the sins of a town. It was about a lie that had been passed down from generation to generation. It was about a mother's gut feeling, a journalist's courage, and a man's final act of redemption. The story of the Fenwick boy was over, but the legacy of his death and the lives of the other children would live on. The truth had finally come out, and it had a name, and its name was justice. The horror was over. The healing had begun. The final chapter of this nightmare was written not in a book, but in a small, quiet act of a mother and father, holding each other in the quiet solitude of a new cemetery, under a new sky, finally, at peace. The Fenwick boy was finally home.